National interest in the car started growing. The president of the Historic Vehicle Association wanted to document the car for the Library of Congress.
This will be the 15th vehicle that will be recognized by the National Historic Vehicle Register, and it is being documented in a way that we actually documented the Statue of Liberty and the Space Shuttle. This is a program that's a 500-year, 1,000-year program about what it was like in America with the automobile at our time.
What is a pilot? By definition, it is a hand-built example of the prototype process of the General Motors. Sounds pretty simple, huh? Well, it's not, and it's caused decades of confusion within the car hobby. This confusion is precisely the reason why Pilot Car Registry was founded. To research, document, and evaluate prototype examples for the educational and historical enjoyment of future generations. These efforts are extensive, and they are complex. No single example of a surviving pilot prototype is comparable to a assembly line car that would have followed. This is because these prototypes were hand-built one at a time, utilizing prototype parts that were marked pilot, prototype, or handmade. This process, in many cases, came months before the establishment of mass production assembly lines. And this is precisely what these prototype processes are meant to test and ready. These manufacturing and assembly prototype programs would create handmade adaptations that could ultimately be tested for quality, fit, and ease of assembly. If a part or piece of sheet metal was found to have a more efficient or cost-effective adaptation, it was modified or changed at that point. Consequently, small variations can be seen on surviving examples.
To people sensitive to design, the Camaro is a good, honest piece of sculpture. From any angle, the car has a dynamic shape, the look of today with no compromises and no excuses. It's quite a contrast from the flat or slab-sided look or the squared-off boxy look. These aerodynamic lines were subjected to extensive tests in a jet aircraft wind tunnel. The Camaro is truly a product of the space age. It has what the stylists call roll under, for a lean look. And the curved side glass and roof give it a lot of what we call tumble home, that slanted in feeling at the top. Tumble home and roll under are key design elements in the cylindrical shape of the car. A trend-setting shape considered an ideal approach to modern automotive design.
When portions or the entirety of these prototype programs were found to be as efficient as possible, the appropriate tooling would then be built by the participating divisions within General Motors or their allied vendors and suppliers. This tooling would allow for the mass production of parts and designs that had previously been made by hand and approved during the pilot prototype process, and is also the equivalent of the Mona Lisa or the Holy Grail to automotive historians. But it's not that simple, at least when you're trying to understand the historical differences between surviving examples. These cars were meant to be the first of the working prototypes. Up until this part of the process, modeling studies were performed that started with drawings.
Nothing contrived, a direct approach to design that will be in style for years. Look right in any setting and have its own distinct personality. Wow.
Continued to Clay.
Two-dimensional drawings must be translated into three-dimensional clay models.
Evolved balsa wood and alternative artistic materials
and components are fitted into a wooden framework of the F-car.
And ended with full-scale fiberglass models.
On a full-scale fiberglass model. It won't run, but it looks enough like the real thing to fool an expert.
None of these models were ever intended to be driven because they didn't have the structural integrity to carry the weight of their passengers or the drivetrain.
That's Oscar, sitting in for thousands of owners to be.
The best seat height and seating angle are not just for Oscar's comfort, but to make him more efficient behind the wheel. Does he have ample leg room, hip room, shoulder room, and head room? These are important questions to be answered. How well can he see in front, at the sides, and in the rear?
And at the end of the day, they were just artistic models. If these non-working models were accepted for potential mass production, The next phase becomes confusing for a lot of historians. For the most part, General Motors would use the closest thing they had to a comparable example for testing a drivetrain component and passenger fitment. This was done by the assignment of assembly line donor cars, typically just a few, that could be grafted with potential design changes prior to prototype sheet metal processes, being created for a pilot prototype program that might involve up to 50 vehicles. It was a very inexpensive and timely way of satisfying viability prior to the commitment to the final stages. These portions could be very crude, depending on how closely the donor car resembled that of the proposed car. The refinements to these cars would vary exponentially, based upon how long or lengthy the final stages of the design studies were. But at the end of the day, they were still not intended to be the final stages of the prototype process, because a different car had been used. Very similar to a crude custom. Once a design study had formal approval, it progressed to the final stages. This would be the final feasibility studies prior to a mass assembly line production.
Prototypes that do run are next on the schedule. Time for the showdown. Will the car live up to expectations? Again, the test miles pile up. Day and night, around the clock, rugged testing, far exceeding the driving demands made on the average car.
And would create the first truly working prototypes that could be utilized at the proving grounds by engineering and testing, sales divisions for national sales conventions and local promotions all over the country, engineering body of design for their approval prior to tooling, and manufacturing with their multitude of testing requirements. So, understanding these processes and their historical significance was pretty easy, right? We were dealing with the first working prototypes easy peasy. Nope, not so. Case in point, these prototype activities' historical importance are based upon how much of the new car is truly new and a different design. Obviously, if we're talking about a first year of an entirely new product line, the whole car is a prototype. Compare this to the prototype activities of design changes to just the taillights or interiors within a model line that has already been manufactured for years, and you get last year's assembly line mass-produced parts, the only prototype taillights and interior. It's still a pre-production prototype, but the amount of changes from last year's production becomes the focus of attention. Another example is drive chain changes within the model year. Say the switching of the prototype testing of the 396 to the 454 in the middle of the year as an option package. The only part of that pilot activity that is truly special is the motor, and frankly, that was installed in mass production on the assembly line. So, not really prototype activities in a large scale, which is precisely why it wasn't necessary to accomplish outside of normally executed assembly line environment. These cars are known to exist with handwritten notes on assembly line build sheets that note these limited pilot activities, but they are not pre-production pilot prototypes by classification. Starting to get more complicated, huh? Obviously, the most historical examples are the pre-production prototypes, but they were not built with typical build sheets. Their build configuration were instead logged in a pre-production build booklet. This allowed a small grouping of qualified personnel to all share all of the build configurations in the exact same format. This format would allow for personal notes by these individuals, notes that could be reviewed for more effective change ideas, all part of the process. So, when we find and procure original factory documentation for these programs and safeguard them within our archive, they cover all of those builds within that pilot prototype program. In many cases, these booklets lead us to the proverbial holy grail, the ability to absolutely and definitively prove which prototype was what and which one belongs in the Smithsonian. But sometimes, the booklets underscore why it is necessary for an organization like Pilot Car Registry to conduct research to such great lengths. An example of this is the pre-production 1967 prototype Chevelles. This particular program had 5 participating prototype programs, 4 at factories across the country and 1 at the traditional pilot facility. This was necessary because these activities were meant to test not only manufacturing processes, but the variance that could be evident from factory to factory. These differing mass production processes existed because of the age of the factories and their individual management. Consequently, Caltex exists in 5 different variants on these particular models, and 5 different VIN number 1s were built. And in this precise scenario, Pilot Car Registry cannot definitively prove which of these prototypes were built first out of these 5 competing programs. Additionally, variants within the Caltech stampings are only predictable within their own individual programs. Try explaining that to an author that needs to paraphrase it in one paragraph, or an individual that took a picture of a Caltech that ran over a block on a televised auction and thinks they all should be identical. Frankly, if it wasn't for our archive of original factory documents and the involvement of the General Motors Heritage Center, these examples would be lost forever. Bottom line, they're all different in their own historical way. That's how they were built and intended to be. They are not going to be the same because their existence served to find the most efficient way of building their counterparts in a mass assembly atmospheres. The reality is General Motors was engaged in creating financially viable manufacturing platforms. These processes were complex and varied from factory to factory, from decade to decade, and from program to program. Along the way, some of these surviving examples of these manufacturing platforms become national treasures, but they sure weren't foreshadowed to be 50 years ago.